No?
Is that music like a live band?
I have one verse.
Yeah, you had one verse.
Yeah, they usually have bands, I think, every night.
But
or every day. So you're going to hear it often.
okay. So for tonight, when I was praying about what to go over and so on, it's interesting because in a lot of ways it goes along with what we've been talking about. A couple weeks ago we talked about the perception of God and the idea of trying to please Him.
Mm-hmm.
Then last week we talked about people pleasing and kind of the core of that. And to continue kind of along those lines with an aspect of this and kind of drawing us to this place, all that I got when I asked for what to pray about, or what to share here, was God gave the word about transformation, and that being the crux of what we would be discussing tonight. Now, I didn't get a verse, per se. I got a collection of stories, and then I did get one verse out of the Bible that, applies, but this isn't really about a Bible study tonight, as much as it is a discussion about what transformation is and the realities of what it looks like for us. So we talked last week about, or when we talk about trying to please God and we talk about people pleasing, there's a core thing there that we all need to look at. And I think it's really, it's been funny all day talking to different people and hearing just how much of this message has been being spoken to people here and there. Even when you read Colossians 3 and gazing through that and what that talks about, that correlates directly to this.
Yeah. Yeah, it talks about living in the new identity.
Yeah. And that's the thing of this, is so if there's one thing, to be real, that unifies us as a group, it's fear.
Yeah.
The fear of being seen, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of being wrong, the fear of being hurt. Everyone in this group, in some way, is either hiding or overcompensating. So everyone in this group is, in some way, reacting to fears that they carry. And so much of our lives have revolved around that. Everything from the way we posture ourselves, to the identities that we bear, to the way that we try to make ourselves something to people. Hence the reason for the discussion about people-pleasing, because that's what that comes from. There are a lot of different things that it can be, but at the core of it, there's the fear of not being good enough for people, of people rejecting us. And where it correlates to God, the fear of God rejecting us. So the thing of it was even in this discussion about transformation here, the reason why we talk about this and then also talking about those things, even the reason why we discuss and look so wholeheartedly at where we're not meeting God, is not because understanding that is going to change anything, okay? Just to clarify, going over these messages and seeing where our hearts are not aligning with God, that's to bring light to where we're not meeting Him, where we're not receiving from the Holy Spirit. Recognizing that you have a problem doesn't mean it's fixed.
It reveals the need.
Yes. It reveals the need. And that's the thing, is at the end of the day, the crux of this message falls down to this place, that transformation in our hearts and minds and souls comes from God. That's something that we don't make happen. And it's important to understand that, because we really don't. Everyone says this. I think everyone in this room, and even Brendan here, can acknowledge that we all agree that we cannot transform ourselves. But when it comes down to how we live and how we act and how we actually function, it's a totally different thing. Because at the end of the day, a lot of us try to highlight these things, and then we try to take control of them. When it comes down to how we carry these things, I'm going to go and I'm going to force myself into a place that's going to change me. If I don't do this, or if I just adjust my mind in this way, then I'm going to suddenly transform into everything God has told me I am supposed to be. This is the way that we look at it a lot. And even to even go into a lot of what I was given here, there's a place to even acknowledge that when it comes down to our salvation, because see, transformation in our hearts and minds, in our souls and our spirits, is intrinsic to the gospel. What I mean with that is that the idea of rebirth, being reborn, there's a transformation that comes with that, because as we're reborn, it's almost like a new start to our identity, to our person. The old man dies, and we're regrown as something new and different. We transform as who we have been, and those old identities are dropped and allowed to die, are rejected and left to wither. And we move forward in this new transformed state where we've received Jesus, where we've received the Holy Spirit, and we move forward in this with God. We step into a place of reception to Him and live in that. And we see that throughout the scriptures. The stories even that I was given here were Gideon, for example. When the angel first showed up to talk to Gideon, Gideon was afraid. But when he did step in and receive from God that new identity, that person that he was supposed to be, he became a war leader. Think about the significance of going from somebody hiding in a casket or whatever it was to avoid God, and then going from that to leading a war against God's enemies, oftentimes with minimal numbers of soldiers, and expecting that God, and understanding, recognizing that God is going to win you this war. You get 300 people, and you're going to fight an army of 10,000, and you're going to win. That takes a substantial amount of faith. And that's not something that comes about just because he decided, oh, hey, I guess I can trust God. So I'm going to change my mind about God and then walk in this path. Moses is another example. Moses was one who, when he first saw the burning bush, he fought with God about who he was. Said he couldn't be these things. But when you compare the Moses at the burning bush with the Moses that died outside of Israel, these are not the same man. We look at other examples like Peter, who became the crux of the church in so many ways. Jesus spoke, he came to Jesus, he was a fisherman. During his time with Jesus, as he was learning about what it was to be a follower, he was so emotionally driven. He not only, he attacked people, he hurt people, he rejected people, he tried to chase people away. He rejected Jesus. But then you read his letters, and you see a man transformed as he understands core elements of the gospel and what Jesus was talking about. Paul is probably the most dramatic example, the Pharisee, who was holding the men's coats and nodding in approval while they stoned Stephen to death. And then to watch the transformation that happens when he meets Jesus on the road, is blinded and sent to be healed, and receives this place, this new calling, this new identity, this new person, and he goes out and he becomes Paul, the apostle, the guy that half the church is built off of right now. There's a real place here to acknowledge that transformation is a significant portion of what we go through and what we look at and what's intended for us. And the thing that's hard about this is that we hear these stories. These are biblical stories. You can look them up at any point in time. Gideon's in Judges. Moses is in Exodus. And as for the stories of Peter, you can look at any of the 4 Gospels and then compare that with his letters. You can also go look at, read Acts to see the story of Paul. It's all plain and there and easy to find. The problems that we find ourselves dealing with are these. When it comes to salvation, when it comes to learning about who God is, it's interesting because the idea of rebirth is a really easy thing for a non-believer to grasp. And what I mean by that is it's easy to recognize and delineate between the old man and the one who is with God. If you come out of a lifestyle of being like a gang leader, it's easy to determine that that probably was a time when you were not a righteous man. At which point you turn your life over to God and you reject those things, and it's easy to see where you have not been, and easy to see where you're growing into something new. Even if it's not easy to make that transition, it is, and even if it's not easy to drop all that stuff, it is easy to determine where you need God and where you are not representing Jesus.
Because you can see it.
Right. It's so stark, the contrast. The problem for us comes in those who were raised Christian or have spent substantial portions of our lives around Christians. Because it's far murkier. It's a lot harder to determine when we gave our lives to God, and when we didn't. Because there's so much that we've learned in kind of a religious setting as we've been raised in that. We've been raised with the idea that we're beholden to God. We've been raised with the idea that we've given everything to God. We've been raised under his umbrella and are able to say, well, I know this about him. And it's easy to fall back on those old principles because in a lot of ways, we are raised with a lot of the wrong impressions. For those who were raised in church, how many of us now look back and say that we knew God when we were being grown up, and are able to say we understood his character in any way, shape, or form?
Usually only when you're around
Good point.
actual Christians, sometimes you get some hints of that.
Hints
Yeah.
is the key word. But even in this place, like, hints are not good enough. They don't bring us to places where we can even receive the Holy Spirit. And if we're raised in a church where they don't believe in the Holy Spirit, how do we do that? And the frustrating thing about this is that everything seems right. Because the people that we've entrusted to teach us about the gospel and to teach us who God is tell us that we're right.
Yeah.
Even if it's not true. They'll take a version of God and he's hellfire and brimstone. I actually recently just watched a thing where a woman was talking about coming out of the Westboro Baptist Church. She had left that church, come away from it, and was now living. She's not even a Christian anymore now, but they had to draw her away from that. But because she was raised there, she believed that these things were true. There was so much hate and malice and so much cruelty in what she believed about who God was. Mm-hmm. And she believed that that was God. And she believed that she was right. And it took people talking to her, giving her perceptions outside of her church and her community in order to break through that shell of justification. And see, the hardest part about religion, too, is that it brings us to places of believing that we're not good enough. Mm-hmm. It brings us to places of believing that we can never be, and we're not wanted. And we look at our own unrighteousness as being the means by which we determine that we're not good enough. And that's in no way what God taught. That's no way what Jesus taught or exemplified. He went to the most sick and the most broken, and he sat with them and ate with them.
Yeah.
That was a significant thing back in the day. Who do you invite to dinner with you? Your friends, your family? Yes. Of course. People that you like. People that you enjoy. Jesus ate with tax collectors and prostitutes, the dregs of society, because he liked them, he enjoyed them. It wasn't purely for ministry's sake. It was for being with them. And we're not different in that. But we're taught to be. Because so much of the religious aspect of this that we're raised with in church, it comes down to what we can determine as being the bar to judge our righteousness, to be the bar by which we can determine that we are good enough.
Mm-hmm.
That's where so much of this people-pleasing and God, this being terrified of God mentality comes from, is that we're looking at where we're not good enough and determining that, yeah, we screw up.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a place to understand that God is in no way going to abandon us. But I'm not good enough. How can he not abandon me if I'm not good enough? Well, because that bar that you're using to determine your righteousness doesn't determine his view of you.
Mm-hmm.
He'll call attention to the things and confront the issues that we carry, but that does not push the Holy Spirit away. Even looking at those examples like Gideon, as going back to him. After Gideon was transformed, after he spent that time with God, did he continue in a life of righteousness? Was he purely righteous after that? No. No, he wasn't. He ended up having multiple wives, which was considered a sin. Paul had his fair share of mistakes as well. Peter still made mistakes.
And he's compared to Satan.
Yeah.
I guess that was before the transformation.
That was before.
But still.
See, there's a whole thing of this where we need to understand that God's love is not going to be brushed away from us in any way, shape, or form. And see, the thing about transformation and the reason why this is so key to having that happen in our lives comes down to the fact that transformation in all of these examples and in our personal lives comes not from our observance of laws. It doesn't come from our adherence to principles. It comes down to our receiving of the love that's being poured out to us. It comes down to our receiving of the Holy Spirit. It's like one of those experiences that you have to go and have. You can't read about it to appreciate it. You can't have other people tell you about it to appreciate it. You have to literally drop everything and jump in. You let the old man die. You let your fears, your doubts, your judgments, all those different things that you carry die. And you jump into this new person in this new place. And then you let God sanctify those places and draw you closer and build you and teach you and share with you. You do not gain... Think of the gifts of the Spirit. Prophecy as the example. Who can make themselves a prophet? Who can make it so that God tells them tells them things about the world? Not one person can do that. You cannot control God. You cannot determine that you are a prophet because you want to be. You can only receive that gift and live in that after you've received it. Healing. The gift of healing.
Amen.
You cannot decide that you want to lay hands on people and see them healed. That's not something that we control. Either God does it or it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It's very simplistic. It's very straightforward. The same is true of our hearts and our souls and the transformation that comes from the Holy Spirit making us something. We can see the rules and acknowledge what they are. We can see God's heart in them. But they will not make us holy. We talked about the law back when we talked about trying to please God and about how it's a trap. Because when we try to live our lives in accordance with the law, we will only trap ourselves under the judgments that we have to carry as a result of that. On top of that, we make Jesus' death and resurrection moot. Because that's what he fulfilled through that. So in all of this, there's a place to recognize that God's love needs to be sufficient for us. That God's Spirit needs to be sufficient for us. That's the only means by which we will become more than we are. And the verse I was given was John 14. Oops. Before I read it, there's just one other thing. One of the big things with fear is that oftentimes we will try to be afraid and to try to cope with our fear. We will oftentimes try to take control of things that lay before us. It's why we go to this place of like wanting to hold on to the laws. We can control that. We can understand that. We can recognize that, and we can hold that as something to say, this is what makes me good enough. This is what makes me okay. And that gives us a peace of mind because it's something that we're holding on to and making our own.
And think we can understand.
Like there was a time when that was kind of a lot of people's paradigm, but even then there were still people who could see beyond that.
Yeah.